Do you hear me clap once? Do you hear me clap twice? All right, I'm Rosalinde. I direct the Critical Race Studies program, and it is so exciting to see such a huge turnout here today. We were overwhelmed by the demand, and we're just so excited that so many of you are excited about this. We have an amazing panel set up for after the program, after the screening. But because we know we do not want to keep you here till like 11 or 12 at night, even though I know with these panelists, we could talk to have them speak for hours. We know that they want to get to bed. So we are going to start the screening. And after the screening, again, please stay put for a post-screening panel. And I will turn it over to the woman who needs no introduction, Kimberle Crenshaw.
Good evening, everyone. So on behalf of the Critical Race Studies program, the African American Policy Forum, and the Department of African American Studies at UCLA, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel. Some things just seem to be set in motion by forces that are utterly unpredictable, yet when they come together, it seems like they were meant to be. So how fortuitous is it that this year of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the party, we are in the middle of a movement unlike one we've seen in many generations. The reconsideration of some of these issues, growing from consciousness coming from the street, is meeting with consciousness that's being deployed and represented from above, as it were. We're in a moment where Black Lives Matter meets with Beyonce. We're in a moment when Beyonce's performance happens just 10 days before this major PBS documentary happens. So when it all comes together in a moment like this, it seems as though something is meant to happen, and your being here is evidence that something is actually happening. So this seems to be, I think, an important opportunity for us to recuperate the story of the Black Panthers, reevaluate the politics of the Black Panthers, reckon with the destruction of the Black Panthers, and revisiting the legacy of the Black Panthers. So the energy here tonight is rich, and we know that you're really anxious to hear from and engage in our panelists. So my job is to try to get out of the way as soon as possible to keep things moving. So with that in mind, let me introduce the panelists and get our conversation going. So first, we are honored to have Ms. Ericka Huggins with us. So Ms. Huggins is a human rights activist, a poet, an educator, a Black Panther leader, a former political prisoner, and we have to say here tonight, a survivor. So thank you for being here. We also have McMillan. He's Associate Professor of English and African American Studies here at UCLA. And last but certainly not least, my colleague and sister, Professor Cheryl Harris. She's the Rosalinde and Arthur. Gilbert Professor in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and the Interim Chair of the UCLA Department on African American Studies. Welcome, Cheryl. So our plan tonight, we've talked a little bit. We're going to start with a brief conversation among the panelists. We're going to talk a little bit about the contemporary meaning of this renaissance. We're going to talk a little bit about the entry of Black Panther imagery and politics and reality into the consciousness of the country. at the time of their birth. We're going to talk a little bit about the meaning of their destruction and the recovery of their political vision. Then we're going to turn it out to the audience to continue to generate the current meaning of this moment and hopefully come to some ideas about how to move forward. So just to get us started, I wonder how we might all take in this particular moment. So we're looking at 3 full classrooms of people who've come out for this, and this hasn't been planned for like a month. This was like a week. So there really is something going on here. It's called, as people have called certain things, a renaissance. What do you each think, real quickly, is resonating now with people around the Panthers? I'll start with you, Ericka.
Well, first of all, good evening, and thank you for having me here. You can say something.
Yay!
First of all, we were median age party members 19 years old. And the faces I can see, the beautiful faces I can see, you're young. And that's all I want to say right now, that the young people are clearer of mind, have a greater openness of heart, and are more willing. That is, if we're not taught to tamp down our feelings, but to move with what's in front of us. And I see that in you, and everywhere I go, you're so inspiring to me. And I think that as I was watching the film once again, I was remembering where I am. I'm at UCLA, where John Huggins and Al Prentice Bunchy Carter were killed on January 17th, 1969. A day that was unbelievable. So it's important to believe that what you saw on the screen is only what do they say, the tip of the iceberg? Is there a filmmaker out here somewhere? Come on, y'all. Well, there need to be many more films like this. And so that the truth continues to be told, but not just films, that we are making the history together that goes into the films. So much is striking to me tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be really brief. I just want to agree with everything that Ericka just said. I mean, I definitely think there's something about the iconicity of the Black Panthers that still really resonates. I think we definitely saw that with the film. There's a way that I think the image of strength and Black militancy is a symbol that has really resonated largely for the past, 20, 30 years. I think there's a way that folks also, like you're saying, are looking to be inspired, and I think the Black Panthers had a vision, and I think that vision really resonates with audiences still now. So I would just say that. I think also the idea, also with films, like the Black Power mixtape, there's a way that the images that we see with the Black Panthers have really continued to still resonate in popular culture. And later we'll talk about, the media and also even in the art world. So there's a real way that I think that particular image and symbol of what it stands for is part of the reason why we're still talking about the Black Panthers now.
Thank you. Cheryl?
I don't really know why, or that I can add anything in terms of analyzing why. I can say something about an intuition that suggests that part of the, I guess I would say, resilience of the Black radical tradition is to constantly go back and draw upon the power of images and symbols of resistance, particularly at times when it seems like ordinary politics has kind of run out. And that's not to say that I'm diminishing certain forms of electoral politics as a site of struggle. But I am saying that we certainly have been through a period where certain kinds of symbols of electoral politics have failed to deliver on the kinds of things that we know are essential for Black life. And the basic essential need and demand for security, for education, for housing, all of those things are still very much alive as much as they were 50 years ago. And I think that the party and its struggles represents an aspiration, and I quite agree with Ericka, of young people seeking to look beyond the limits of what the sort of standard political conversation seems to offer.
Mm-hmm. So I guess building off of our first round and particularly highlighting the youth of the Panthers, the youth of the folks that we saw. Ericka, there aren't many humans who've had anything close to the experience that you've had. You've been part of a historical moment. You survived one of the most concerted efforts of total destruction known to modern history, and you've now witnessed a resurgence of what you all were trying to do, and a memory of what you were trying to do. So this must be real complicated right now. So what can you share with us about what it is like now to be a witness to your own history, and to be here when it's being reborn? What is this experience like for you?
It's humbling. I'm grateful to be alive, more than anything. And here I am in this school of law. I'm an outlaw. And not the Jesse James kind. Y'all know Jesse James. Anyway, I feel so humble that we were so hated, we were so infamous, and now we're loved and famous. It's paradoxical, and sometimes it's a disorienting dilemma. However, all day for some reason, and usually I don't have these feelings, I've been thinking about John and Bunchy. Do you know who they are, UCLA students?
Tell them.
They were UCLA students, and if you go to Campbell Hall, which maybe is too far out the way for you, but if you go to Campbell Hall, you'll see a big stone in the front that says Ericka Huggins. Students had that stone bought and set in place so that no one ever again would forget them, because the UCLA administration intentionally forgot them. This is what we do, erasure. And so I am so touched that Stanley Nelson and Lorenz Grant and others made a film that brings us back to life in part. Of course, this film is from 1966 to 1973. I was in the Black Panther Party from 1967 to 1981. And what isn't there that I'm hoping people will recover and express are the party's community survival programs, which are mentioned in part there. Oh, some of you know about the community. Can you just name one? The Oakland Community School. Thank you. Yes. The Sickle Cell Research and Education Program. Yes.
Right to adequate housing.
The cooperative housing programs and the fight for adequate housing, and someone said the Free Breakfast for Children program, which embarrassed the federal government so much that it created the National Free Breakfast and Lunch Program. Yeah. The People's Free Medical Clinics. Some of them still exist in the Bay Area. There were like 25 or 30 community programs, and they weren't just in Oakland, they were all over the country. I was in Brazil 3 years ago, and a young man stood up, and he lived in a favela in Sao Paulo. And he said, he was speaking to me in Portuguese, and I don't speak Portuguese. He didn't speak English, but I could understand his heart. He said, "I so love the Black Panther Party, and I've never seen it, that I have created a free food program in my home, in my area," he said. This is how much I love the Black Panther Party. And that was a convening of students who turned out in the hundreds by word of mouth in one day. So it's amazing what we can do. I was thinking, what if everybody in here focused on one program and made it happen? Or made some inroads into structures and systems so that those programs could happen. So I'll shut up now.
So while you're on the program, Ericka, share how you all developed the program. What was it that prompted you to develop these programs?
Well, let's pretend that this is New York City here. Maybe this is Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And maybe this is Atlanta, Georgia, and that's Washington, D.C. We didn't say, we think the people in D.C. they should have. We said, what do you want? What do you need? We will do our best with your help to make it happen. And in each place, people would tell us different things. They said in New York City in the wintertime, we need coats and shoes for our children. Very basic. They said, no, we don't want a school like Oakland Community School. In our community, we need free health care. We need pest control programs in Washington, D.C., and I will assure you that that is accurate because that's where I grew up. And so it was like that. We listened to the people. We served the people, as our motto said, we served the people body and soul. Sometimes we didn't remember our own bodies and souls, which I'll talk about later. But that is what we did. Actually, there's a beautiful book. How many of you have read Alondra Nelson's book, Body and Soul? You should read it. It's about the People's Free Medical Clinics. It's an amazing book. We asked people what was needed. And they didn't just tell us that programs were needed. They told us that they wanted the Black Panther Party to live forever. They didn't believe the hype in the news. Well, first of all, you had to have a TV in order to watch the news. They didn't believe what the newspapers said because we fed their children and we took care of them. And that wasn't a ploy for anything. That's a myth that's out there, that we did it because we wanted to look a certain way. No. As the film ends, we had undying love for the people. That's what motivated us. That's what kept us alive. And I could go on and on and on, but there are other panelists.
Thank you, Eric. Yuri, to a significant extent, what the general public knows about the Panthers largely isn't what we just heard, but it's about a stance, a certain aesthetic. The film frames it in terms of urban blackness, a sort of non-accommodationist stance. So to a certain extent, in the field of representation, there was a lot of work that was done. And at the same time, in that same field, a lot of work was done against the Panthers at the same time. So can you talk about the politics of the field of representation as a site where much contestation was going on about the Panthers and about the state's response to the Panthers?
Yeah, that's a big question. One of the things I think about, so part of it, I think, is a debate about like positive and negative images, I think particularly of the Black community. So I think there's a way that a lot of the debate about the imagery was actually about that larger debate. And I think it also, we should mention, like this is also happening around the time of the Black arts movement, right? So there's a lot of debate about, what constitutes Black art. And a lot of it is about, should art be tied to racial uplift? Should it be tied to positive images of the community? And I think some of the downsides of that, I think, is it also ends up being, people get accused of not making Black art or not being a Black artist. I think that's in part some of the downsides, and I think there's certain artists, who have been left out, in a lot of ways because of that. But yeah, I think there's a way, and I also think of, what Angela Davis' article, Afro Images, talks about the way that the Afro became really iconic, so it almost became separated from the Black Panthers and itself became a symbol in a way that it infiltrated popular culture. So I think that's not as surprising that we see a lot of the Black Panther imagery even now, particularly like in hip hop culture, but the way that it shows up in popular culture a lot as well. So thinking about, for instance, Public Enemy, even Nicki Minaj's use of the Malcolm X kind of rifle stance and the Looking Ass Nigga single. So I think there's a lot of precursors for people who've used it. And I think even though I write a lot about Adrian Piper, who was this conceptual artist in the 70s who was dressing up as a Black male, kind of Black power inspired symbol, in part because for her as a woman artist actually gave her a certain level of freedom in terms of how she was able to walk with her body in public space in a way that being a Black woman artist did not allow her to do. So I think there is a way that for a lot of people, there's a form of elasticity to the body that Black power imagery gives people. So I think it's not only about inspiration and symbols of hope, but there's also a way that there's a certain urgency and energy that translates to like the representational realm that's also part of the story too.
Okay. So I'm going to come back around and ask the more contemporary question about Beyonce, because I know people really want to hear about that. But Cheryl, there's an interesting paradox because in some ways the Panthers were marketed as, received as a position of masculinity, hyper masculinity, some would say. And at the same time, as we saw from the film, the bricks and mortar of the Panthers were the women, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of tension, that kind of contradiction, that encounter, I think for a lot of us who consider ourselves radical Black feminists, is at the core of what kind of motivates us. So describe your encounter as a young woman with the idea of the Panther, the idea of being a Panther woman. How did it shape your consciousness?
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to really have been like in that moment. And to say that it was impactful would really be to understate it. It was, what I think was powerful, and it definitely was a contradiction, is that the Panthers were about revolution. That was very clear. They were not about accommodating to the system, they were about overthrowing it. And if we think about it now, I mean, I didn't have this language then, but it was really about challenging all forms of social relations. From the ones that we think of as being sort of official kinds of social relations, that is between the citizen and the state, but also the relations of the family. Like, what is the relation between men and women? What are the relations between women and women? What are the relations between men and men? All of these things were really much on the table, and the party was seriously about trying to overturn all of the systems of oppression. That was really one of its tremendous powers. It was not, I think, shy about putting all of these questions on the table. And as you point out, much as part of a long history of freedom struggles, women played these central roles, the day-to-day sort of operations of the apparatus and the construction of the apparatus, so to speak. But I was intrigued in the movie by the point where one of the sisters talks about how at certain points there were, I guess, maybe moments where there was an effort to challenge the traditional allocation of roles to say, well, okay, who's going to serve the breakfast versus who's going to do the training today? Obviously, it was not a complete transformation of those relations, but the fact that even those questions were being surfaced was important. Whether or not that was legible to everybody sort of outside of the party, I think what we did see of Black Panther Party women was women who were strong and who were assertive and who were, in a certain kind of context, rejecting a kind of politics of respectability around what Black women could be. And so in that sense, it was extremely powerful and was an image that presented an alternative way of being in one's body, of being in a space. You know, I did my hair instantly as soon as I got to college, which was to say, you know, let it all go out there, and was proud to be mistaken for Angela Davis at the time that she was being hunted down by the FBI. You didn't have to have a big fro, by the way, to be mistaken for Angela Davis. All you had to do was be a Black woman. But I do think that this recognition that liberation required rethinking of all of the social relations from the inside out was a legacy that was extremely powerful, and I think laid the groundwork for what followed, for Combahee River Collective, for all of the stuff that we now recognize as sort of identifiable Black feminist politics and articulation.
So, building on how people came to the Panthers, either sort of in their imaginaries, right? So many of us kind of thought of ourselves as that, or actually becoming a member itself. So the documentary suggests, there's a part of it, Ericka, where they talk about, well, you know, everybody was just coming in, and we didn't have the ability to figure out who was who and what was what. That runs somewhat counter to something you shared about how membership in the party isn't just like membership in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. There were certain aspects of being brought in that was part of a broader political education that was happening. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, knowing Bill Calhoun as I do, I don't think he meant that. I don't think it was counter to anything. He was alluding to the fact that this made us prey to the FBI
Sure.
COINTELPRO, which is, by the way, I didn't tell the whole story of John Huggins and Bunchy Carter. The FBI orchestrated that as well. But back to your question, so he was just pointing out something. We were not concerned about who came because of that same love for everyone. We just wanted other young people to support what we were doing. We had political education classes every week, at least for the first few years that I was in the Black Panther Party. We read every philosopher. We read about all of the ideologies. In order to do that, some people had to learn how to read, because this was not, we weren't college students. This was a cross-section of many different layers of the African American and Latino and white communities. By the way, you should know that we never turned away people who wanted to join the Black Panther Party, so it was quite the multicultural organization. However, I don't think people really know that or have heard anyone say that before. I think that when an organization begins that is white, we don't racialize it. But if an organization begins and they are people of color, they become the Black this or that, the Latina this or that. Just a point I'm making.
Just saying.
Just saying. So, we were serious. I did not drive across the country with John Huggins thinking that I was going to a rally. I really knew that I could die. I knew that John could die. As a matter of fact, I dreamed that the FBI came and got him 2 weeks before he was killed. And I was so grateful when he came home that day. But it was meant to happen in the way that it happened, because it did happen. And there were so many ways in which we were educated. When we went door to door, we didn't have any form of social media. We had pay phones. I was speaking to a group of elementary school students, and a 12-year-old raised her hand and said, "Miss Ericka, what's a pay phone?" And so we had feet. We had mouths. And we went, as many people said, door to door for everything. We stood on corners and talked to people. You saw people talking to others about articles in the newspaper about the 10-point program. We did our best to educate ourselves, and we came from all layers of community, so bringing everyone to the same page wasn't really possible or intended, but at least that we knew what we were doing somewhat. And we were so young and naive. We really believed that, as one of our other famous quotes says, we will see revolution in our lifetime. No. And it took a while before we really recognized that that wasn't going to happen at maybe the 10th or the 11th funeral. So I look at it and I know that we really were committed people, and we really understood what it would take to turn the tide, to change the systems of inequity, and to rattle the infrastructure so that new could form. That's the other inspiring thing about the organizations that are appearing now. A lot of my friends didn't like Occupy. I loved Occupy because they were saying the same thing, 99.1%. The same thing we were saying then. And I'm just so in love with Black Lives Matter. I just believe that the more that we can stand up and speak whatever our truth is, though there will be pushback, the more we do that, the more people will begin thinking a different way. I think that's part of this renaissance that you talked about. There's so many voices saying something, something important. So, no, we were pretty ragtag, but most of us were aware of what was happening. And though we didn't know that the FBI had a name for its internal organization, the counterintelligence program, we did know very early on that we were being infiltrated by, as we put it, the government.
Well, on that, I want to go to Cheryl. We don't frequently talk in this country about political assassination, political prisoners, repression. And when we do talk about it, we talk about it like it happened a long time ago. And like there aren't currently political prisoners right now. So I guess what difference do you think it would make if there was more of a discourse? We did know more about COINTELPRO, number one. I mean, it's just not something that people seem to know about. And what is the significance of COINTELPRO now?
So I want to build on Ericka's comments about education and thinking about the Panthers. First of all, why COINTELPRO comes into being. And it comes into being in part because of the radical threat that the party represents. And indeed, in fact, Hoover was very clear about that, that he directed all of the Bureau's offices to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize Black organizations and leaders, including the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Nation of Islam, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, but especially the Panthers. And especially the Panthers because of the recognition of the radical potential that they held. And it goes back to this notion of the relationship of education to the entire project. So we think, you know, we're in a moment now where education under a kind of neoliberal model is a commodity in which we treat students like consumers, where they buy product that we're supposed to package and sell, and for which you all sign things called loans and incur debt, and you know, is extracted from you on the back end in some kind of way. This model of education was entirely different because it had to do with understanding it as a popular project. That is to say, understanding its relationship to the people's conditions. And because I want to turn back to the specific question of COINTELPRO, I want to raise up at least what I see as sort of a very significant history that's crucial to understand, which is the murder of Fred Hampton. So you saw Fred Hampton on the film. I want to just read something from the earlier part of the speech of the clip that's in the film, because he's talking about education. He says, with no education, the people will take the local foundation and start stealing money because they won't really be educated as to why it's the people's thing anyway. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, you have neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, like you've got in Africa now and like you've got in Haiti. So what did he just do there, right? He just connected the struggle locally to an international understanding and vision. So what are we talking about here is there has to be an educational program that's very important. As a matter of fact, reading is so important for us that a person has to go through 6 weeks of our political education before we can consider them a member able to even run down ideology of the party. Why? Because if they don't have an education, then they're nowhere. They're nowhere because they don't even know why they're doing what you're doing. You might get caught up in the emotion of this movement. You understand me? You might be able to get them caught up because they're poor and they want something. And then if they're not educated, they'll want more. And before you know it, they'll be capitalists. And before you know it, we'll have Negro imperialists. So this is why COINTELPRO comes into being, because this kind of clarity and this kind of message was something that that could not be tolerated. So you had basically the creation of this project inside the government, which actually didn't get exposed until there was a break-in in March of 1971 in Media, Pennsylvania, that disclosed all of these documents. But the murder of Fred Hampton, the assassination of Fred Hampton, was basically a COINTELPRO project. And what is its what I think it recognizes is that Black radical expression is always seen as a terrorist threat. And COINTELPRO was really the solidification of that equation, the equation of a Black radical project as a criminal terrorist threat that allowed for the unleashing of the kind of violence against them that it's almost even hard to imagine. Every time I've seen the film before, but it's hard to almost imagine how visceral and direct that was in terms of just sort of in terms of mobilizing this kind of violence. In terms of the contemporary legacy of COINTELPRO, I think one can see very clearly how dissent continues to be subject to the claim that it's criminal conduct. And the criminalization of dissent and the mobilization of the state's resources against it is certainly not unique to COINTELPRO, but the logic, the apparatus that we now see in terms of the way in which national security is defined, how dissent is defined even in terms of it being speech itself as sometimes being a threat, and the political views of a particular group or body of people being sufficient grounds to treat them in a particular way. That's all, I think, a legacy of COINTELPRO. And we continue to have political prisoners today, even though that's not often recognized. I think it was about a week and a half ago, Robin sponsored a visit of Sekou Odinga, who was recently released, and Mutulu Shakur was supposed to be released but has not been. These are all names that have been, as Ericka said, erased, but these are all, I guess I would say, the living legacy of the destruction of COINTELPRO, and the fact that they are still alive and in their right minds is a testament to their spirit. So I want to honor that.
Thank you, Cheryl. So this might be the perfect time, Erie, to come to you. So Cheryl's talked about the criminalization of dissent, particularly Black radical dissent, which may give us some purchase on why Beyonce's Super Bowl performance has caused much of America to have a nervous breakdown. So, what's your thoughts about the discourse around the performance? Because there's a lot.
There's a lot to say. I think what's interesting, so, okay, some of my students are here from my undergrad class. So my undergrad class, we've been reading this book called Racial Icons, and one of the things is kind of the idea, like, what's the difference between, like, a Black icon and a regular icon? And one of the things that's the difference is racial icons, particularly Black icons, are always at once celebrated and also derided, and they kind of navigate both of those poles. So what I mention this because with Beyonce, what I think is interesting is we're kind of seeing that dynamic with her in this performance, right? So I think all the debates around it have been, I don't want to say all the debates have been interesting, but this whole idea, like, I've seen a lot of these debates on Facebook about the way that Beyonce is Black now, all of a sudden. Which I think in itself is interesting. So what I think is interesting about her using the Black power particularly is the way that it's a trope that she uses. So I'm interested not so much what the trope means for her, but I'm interested in what it enables her to do. And what I think is interesting is the way that the trope of Black power gets used as this kind of conduit to call up all these other things, like, mass incarceration, New Orleans. So I think that in itself is interesting. But I think it also brings up some interesting, arguments that I think I've seen people having. I think one of them is around audience, right? So was that particular video intended to be for Black audiences, or was it for mainstream audiences? I think it was one of them. I think one of the harsher ones has been if it perhaps reduces Black power to an effect or a style. And I think the other one along that line has been, does it actually obscure mass movements and focusing on her as an icon and actually not on something like Black Lives Matter? So I think those are some of the debates. I think those particular debates are more interesting than some of the other ones that I've seen her actually keep folding it back on to her as a celebrity, and not really talking about what's being conjured by using Black power in the way that she's used it. So I think that's a more interesting way to look at it, and not so much debates about, she's a Black icon now, she's not white anymore, because I just think that's not an interesting way to kind of think about, what is she actually doing by using that particular imagery, and what is it supposed to convey? So I think that's a much more interesting kind of way to think about it.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question, but I know you all probably have things you'd like to ask. So if you have some questions, why don't you generate it? How are we going to do it, Jasleen?
So we have a mic that I will bring around. For people in the other rooms, if you want to come in, and the people in the other rooms can line up on the aisles, and others in this room, I will bring the mic around.
Okay, all right. So Ericka, I think many of us, I want to go back for a moment to Freddie. Just these few moments that we were able to spend with him in the film, so completely demonstrated that his potential and what his leadership could have done was endless. It just was boundless.
Yes.
What more would you want to share with us about him.
Well, first of all, every time, I've seen the film many times, intentionally. And I remember the day that, I think I told you this last night, that the four women were incarcerated together in New Haven, Connecticut. I was one of them. And we weren't allowed to be in, I want you to think about what I'm saying as I say it, because I've found in speaking that people hear different things, and that's good. So we were not allowed to be in the mainstream population of the prison. We were in what was called the Panther wing. And after fighting a lot about it, our lawyers made it so that we could get one small radio and one beat-up TV to watch the news. And on December 4th of 1970, we were watching the news, and we see the house in which Fred Hampton is killed, and then we see Fred's body being brought out. And there we were in lockdown, feeling something like powerless, but stunned and shocked because he was such a beautiful human. If you have ever the opportunity to be in the presence of someone who is kind and compassionate and who is beyond measure, full of light and willingness to serve, hang out with that person. We knew in those moments that there was no way that we would be able to be in the presence of that light again. And it so reminded all of us of why we were there in that prison, and why we had to, if we would ever get out, because we thought we would spend the rest of our lives there. And due to the great upsurge on May Day in New Haven, that helped us to get out. But the thing is that we knew we had to continue to struggle wherever we were. And so we have, those of us who are alive. Not all of us are alive. As a matter of fact, I wanted to just comment that 4 of the people in the film, Wayne Farr included, who says, "I'm just a black man," have passed on. So you see, it's important that these stories get told. It's important that I finish writing my book. I'm saying that to myself.
Yes, yes.
And I want to also say that Fred's son is an activist and travels all over the world. He never got to know his father. But the fact that he is alive and that his mother is alive is a miracle.
Yeah.
I want to say one more thing that I found out soon after Fred was killed, because I want you to think about how infrastructures and collaborations work. The police department was able to, in Chicago, was able to borrow, to make a deal with the Chicago phone company, don't know the name of it, to borrow their phone company trucks to come in the middle of the night to assassinate Fred. So when we hear the news today about this young black woman or this young black man who are killed by the police, watch your mind as it says, well, what was the reason why they say they murdered her? Well, you know, he actually did have a weapon. No person should be killed in these ways. There isn't anything a human can do to deserve it, and then to be killed over and again posthumously. So please listen to yourselves as you kill Beyonce. She did something. Why did she do what she did? What was it that she wanted us to know? She did something, and I'm grateful to her. And I will tell you something else, that many, 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 many Black Panther Party members are grateful to her. Because of her, we are again alive in the minds and hearts of people. So many people do not know about the Black Panther Party. She's made people want to know. She used her art and her stage to tell us something. Why did she choose that? So you might not like my gratitude. I don't really care. Because we can use our cognitive space to unpack all kinds of things, and it would, I feel, a better use of our great intellect and beautiful hearts to figure out what we can do now to uplift where we are in the bodies that we're in, with the connections, the skills and experiences we have to change the epidemic of murder in our country, rather than focusing on an artist. So that's just me. That's just me. So Fred was incredibly dear to all of our hearts, and he still is. And I'm so grateful that you got to see something of him. There is an old documentary called The Murder of Fred Hampton, which has more of him. And thank you so much for reading that speech. Thank you. I want to say that Fred, one of the heartbreaking things about Fred's death is that he was typical of young men and women in the Black Panther Party. And I don't have time to talk about all of them who were killed, but typical rather than atypical. So thank you for your question.
Thanks. So now it's time for you all to offer your questions, comments. So, and please make them quick, right? So I'm going to take about 3 or 4, and if you all are very good, we'll get a chance to take 3 or 4 more. Okay, right. Well, Jocelyn, go ahead. You.
First, thank you all, and especially Ms. Huggins. I was born and raised in Oakland. In the
Thank you.
And although I went to school after the community school was closed, I feel like the educators really, there was a reverb of the work that you've done throughout Oakland, and the educators really took that mission seriously. About education, you started off by saying that maybe that some of us could think about implementing maybe one of those community programs. And then, Professor Harris, you read in that excerpt about the importance of education as a tactic against capitalism and letting capitalism take over our energy. I'm interested in how we reconcile some of the community work like education and thinking of educators, including professors who, especially those of color who often do more than their share of that kind of labor, how we reconcile that kind of work, the education, the community work, with the work that's more sexy and gets more of, I guess, the attention in terms of radical expression or perceived as radical. So if we could reconcile the debate between Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton in terms of community versus the most radical representation, the most radical protest. How do we do that? How do we make it so we have both arms kind of working together instead of understanding the movement in separate factions? I'm just interested in education as a radical thing, especially when you talk about people who cannot read. We still have that issue. There's a correlation between people who enter the school to prison pipeline and illiteracy. We still have illiteracy as an issue, but that's not necessarily considered a radical thing to do. So how do we reconcile that?
I think we got that. All right, 2 more questions quickly. Jesseline?
We get someone who came from the overflow room.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Olive. I'm part of the Revolution Club here at UCLA. So I have taken note of how what is focused on so often and really emphasized about this film and the Black Panther Party, about what we are to continue as people who care about the world, as young people who are wanting to change things, have some impact in society. What we are told to focus on are the social uplift programs. I'm not sure how it was referred to, but the programs uplifting the community. But we can see that, you know, the situation for people in Black communities, in minority communities, for disenfranchised people here and globally, the situation has not changed. So, like, it persists because the structures, the systems, the institutions still persist. They have not been, they remain intact. So why should we focus on those rather than on actually making a revolution?
Okay. One last question.
There's all of us here. So first off, thank you guys. TK, Flory, for part of Black Lives Member, part of the crew that shut down the 405, just so folks remember that happened, you know. I'm part of the Undercommons here, just so folks know. I wanted to do a brief announcement. The Undercommons here is our freedom school here on campus. We repurposed the Jan Steps to talk about things that we can't really talk about in class. And so just so folks know that's happening. Also, we took from learned from the free breakfast program and do a Liberate the Plate. So hella folks out there that need like groceries and stuff, we give away 2 boxes of organic groceries every class at the Undercommons, Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 12 to 3 come through. Yeah, and then I guess for me, what I always realize as a part of resilience and revolution is self-care. I know, Ericka, you mentioned the body and soul, and so for me, a really important question is, what do you guys do for self-care, and what is your practice like, you know? Because I feel like, you know, at the end of the day, that's something that we can take away and hold in our hearts that will, you know, help us continue to move forward as opposed to disintegrate and, you know, get trampled by the system.
Okay. All right, Eric and Cheryl, we can take this round, and then we'll have another round, I think.
I guess I want to try to extract what I understand the questions to be regarding education and how to reconcile perceived tension between a model that focuses on, I think the articulation was sort of popular education or education to address questions of sort of illiteracy versus another kind of sort of thinking about education maybe as high theory or the like. And what I think is quite powerful about the party is that, and I don't want to romanticize this because obviously there were serious divisions and debates about this, what I quite admire about that is that that means that you're taking the idea very seriously. And I think that that's, the debate is actually something I think we should actually hold and push forward so that we can understand better, not to actually try to resolve it once and for all, because honestly, I don't think these debates are resolvable in that way. But I guess I would just say that one of the things that's quite powerful about the party is that it tried to work those out, not at the abstract level. That is to say, this tension was something that came up out of the out of the day-to-day practice. Where do we spend our time? How do we allocate our time? What do we do with the resources that we have? And this relationship then between education as a popular project and theory was not one in which theory was set aside for certain people to think about. Theory was, that was one of the beautiful things about the paper. You had to have your chops up to read that paper, right? And it wasn't because it was written in some kind of completely inaccessible way, but rather it represented an attempt to grapple with these ideas and apply them in the context in which Black people found themselves in the United States. One of the things that was incredibly powerful about it, and I alluded to this before, was the internationalist vision that it encompassed. The understanding that the liberation of people, Black people in the United States, was tied to people globally. And that wasn't, the party wasn't the first formation to ever articulate that, but to actually try to take that up as part of a popular education project, that was really quite powerful. So I guess I would say that that tension is there, that tension is productive, and I think that it's productive of knowledge in a way that is useful to sort of study it and to think about, rather than thinking about these things as disconnected, rather think about the ways in which they might be really intimately connected. That is to say, if we were really to think about what it means to address illiteracy, I was thinking about what you said about illiteracy. I know some people who can read who are illiterate. Okay, I think that there's things that we can try to, address, but that's just my thought.
Ericka, do you want to...
I did want to mention one thing. Uri had to leave to catch a red-eye flight tonight, but I know that he shares with us the great honor of being on the program, so I just wanted to mention that.
So there was a question of self-care, and I know it was something that you wanted to address.
Yes. I want to let you know that we did not have a method for self-care in the Black Panther Party. And when we look back at that history, all of us agree that we needed it for the purpose of healing now. We needed it then. And also, some of us still have not healed. It was very traumatic. David Hilliard called us the walking wounded. So what I did, and this is how I can only talk about my own lived experience. When I was incarcerated and separated first from John, because he'd been killed, and then from my 3-month-old daughter, I thought, I'm not going to go out like this. I've got to do something. And so I taught myself to meditate.
Wow.
And there were a couple of people who said silly things like, that's for white folks. We would never, ever, and having had this experience, I can attest to it, we would never stay up for 10 to 20 days without sleeping, even in law school. We would not do that. That creates illness. However, we do not rest our minds. And so they're constantly having committee meetings. And even in our sleep. And so I knew that with my mind racing about will I ever be able to see my daughter again, and my heart in shattered bits, I needed to do something. And I asked Charlie Gary, one of our lawyers, to get me a book on Hatha Yoga postures. And he did. And the book said, you can do these poses because your body's alignment and your breath will bring you back to balance. And then after that, sit quietly and notice your breath. Just sit. And so there I was, locked away in that prison. By this time, I was the only one in the Panther wing because everybody else had been released. You see, they wanted to cut the head off of the party, thinking that the body would die. But not that I was at the head, but I was considered a leader. At any rate, so this practice of meditation helped me to live, and not just to survive, but to thrive. And because I am still active in communities all over the world, I have continued to do this, and I have found that it is not only healing, but I experience great joy in humanity as a result. And I don't feel jaded and burnt and pissed off. And who's the guy that walks around with the big black cloud over his head? You know, the cartoon character. Anyway, I'm not like that. So I would suggest I get there and then I check myself is what I'm saying. I'm saying that things still happen and the emotions still come and the mind still races, but I have a way of bringing myself back to harmony. So it's important for activists. Actually, social justice work without any spiritual, not religious, spiritual practice creates illness. And spiritual practice without giving what one has learned in social justice work is equally imbalanced. So many of us are now looking to ways in which we can heal ourselves, those of us who are willing to face what we went through, what harm was brought to us, and also what harm we brought. Thank you for that question.
Okay, so I take it you all want to ask a few more questions. Is that right? All right, here's the deal. They have to be 30-second questions because we have 6 minutes. So suck it up, do it fast, get to the point.
Okay, the point about international influence of Black Panthers, and it does come about in the film with the travels to Vietnam. I wanted to know, something that didn't come about in the film is the inspiration that Black Panthers gave to a Dalit group in India.
Yes.
In 1972 they formed and they called themselves Dalit Panthers.
Yes.
And what comes about in the narratives is almost just one line that Black Panthers inspired Dalit Panthers. I want to know how this inspiring happened halfway across the world. Was it only through news or media, or was it through any personal interface that the two groups might have had?
Okay, that was good. Thanks. 30 seconds. There's one here, and then over here. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello. I just have a question about channeling rage into productivity. This kind of goes back to the quote that Professor Harris made from Fred Hampton. How do we, and I'm asking from my own social position as a graduate student, encountering this campus every day, which is very anti-Black, just friendly to a lot of oppressed groups. How do we channel that rage into productivity, especially in a space like UCLA?
All right, that's perfect. Thank you. Do like her. Go ahead. You
Cam, you
get a
pick
couple
somebody.
there, and Carl's had his hand up over here, so just grab one and over here.
Hello, my name is Aman. I had a quick question around how do we reconcile political education with the moment that we're in, especially considering there are a lot of different communities that have different political ideologies. So thank you.
And Jocelyn, the person right behind you? Yeah. Yeah, I got him.
Good evening, sisters. I'm Shannon Rivers, American Indian Movement. I just wanted to talk just ask you a quick question. in the 70s and in the 60s and 70s, a lot of our women were being harassed, murdered by the FBI, and we know the stories of that connection. And a lot of our Indian women still have that impact, including my mom. I just talked with her about this issue. But can you relate to this separation of our men and our women at the time, and really trying to isolate them from one another and to actually turn against one another, and and eventually putting people like Leonard Peltier in prison on false accusations from a woman who wasn't collectively all there. So how do we deal with some of that ongoing trauma? I just came from prisoner of war camp reservation. We call it reservation or home. How do we deal with that ongoing healing? I think you probably addressed that, but between our men and our women sometimes.
Okay. And over here, that's 30 seconds here, and then there's these in the back. So if everyone plays nice, we can get the rest of these in, okay?
Okay, look, I'm from the era of the Black Panther Party. I was around, I was impacted by them. They mobilized people to stand up and fight the system's attacks, and they called for revolution to bring the whole system down. And today, the world cries out even more urgently for revolution than then. And my name is Carl Dix. I'm on a national student tour. I'm a representative of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the message that we're bringing to students is the world don't have to be this way. An actual revolution could totally transform it, not a campaign to elect a new head of the empire, but an actual revolution to bring the system down. And our message is, get with this revolution. Check out the leadership we have for it in Bob Avakian and his works, and join us in fighting the power and transforming the people for revolution, including getting with a call for a student strike with this theme: stop police terror, which side are you on? Just like the students in the 60s took up the fight against Jim Crow segregation and lynch mob terror, this generation's students have got to take up this fight against the police terror, because that's who's lynching our people now. I'm going to be here. Talk with me about this. Let's get into this.
Great.
Oh, and Brewing Cafe tomorrow at 4:30.
Okay, and grab a few in the back. Are you guys remembering?
Peace. Dr. Huggins, I've been wanting to meet you since I was like 11 years old, so it's a really blessing to see you in the flesh, and I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice. I guess my question is about spirituality in the movement. We see people like Dhoruba bin Wahad, Jamil Al-Amin, and other political prisoners embrace Islam, and also you beginning to meditate in 1971, and also Huey P. Newton talking about meditating in the Oakland County Jail with the Soul Breaker. So I wanted to ask about the fundamental nature of spirituality in social movements. And then for Dr. Cheryl Harris, I wanted to ask a quick question about reconsideration of mass incarceration. We see that COINTELPRO used incarceration to target specific leaders, but I want to consider it maybe as a way of combating a mass movement. We see a criminalization and imprisonment of the black poor masses. Is that a response potentially to the mass appeal that the Black Panther Party and other such organizations had, and a way of social and political control? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. So I'm a black trans femme that wants to ask this question. How many other people are black trans feminine people up in here? So I just wanted to ask a question about the popularity of the Panthers. I feel like what tends to be really popular is, well, or unpopular, I guess, is the underpinning logics that you all were for, and the logics that the ideologies that you were particularly against. I just want to ask you all, since 50 years ago, the Black Panthers believe that we're living in fascism, what do you tend to call what we're living in now? Do you believe that this is actually still fascism? What would you call that?
Okey-doke. Thank you all for cooperating. So I'm going to start with you, Ericka, and then move to Cheryl. Is that okay?
Yes. Do you want to go before me? Because I'm still...
Okay.
Okay.
There is a lot in here.
Yeah.
A lot. I guess I want to say that the question of how, as people subject to the kinds of historic and present forms of oppression that we experience, how to do more than survive, but to thrive and to find a way to exist is a question that has existed since we've arrived on the shore. And I don't think that there is any, I think for indigenous people, I think for people who have come in different, as a result of the pull to extract their labor, I think that we all, even though we are coming from these different pathways, find ourselves with the similar challenge that I think the sister asked over here about how do we exist in this space. The simple and the complicated answer is through struggle, and because there isn't any reason, if we look at all of the forces that have been aligned against us, that any one of us should be alive in here. And the fact that we are, I think, represents the collective knowledge and practices of many people who we know, that is our immediate, the people who nurtured us, as well as the names of the people that we don't know. So that's really probably not a very satisfactory answer in the sense of what to do, but what to do, I think, often is actually right in front of our faces, in the sense of, I think about that old image of throwing down your bucket where you are. And it goes back to something Ericka was saying, which is if you're looking for the answers to what to do, look to where the need is greatest. And look to what people are saying. People are very clear, really, about what they need. It may, and I'm not romanticizing that either. I mean, you know, you can step up to somebody on the corner and they tell me, I need $20. You know, you got it. but I am saying that I'm talking about in terms of the aspiration that people have for their own lives, the lives of their children, the lives of their family, and so forth. I also, I guess, wanted to speak to this question of mass incarceration. I really do appreciate the fact that there's been a paradigm shift about thinking about the ways in which the practices, the contemporary practices of incarceration have been, that mass incarceration as a phrase has challenged that, right? Has forced us to look at that and to understand that as a problem, right? But I also want to understand that this has been a long-standing historical practice of the state with reference in particular to racialized communities and in particular to Black people. Mass incarceration is the name that we call it now. It used to be called a lot of other things. It used to be called chain gangs. It used to be called convict labor. And we're still there. We have contemporary forms of that right now. So that's not to say that I don't think that history matters and that the context, and I took the question to be the shift from sort of a practice of incarcerating leaders in the movement to sort of incarcerating the entire communities, right? I do recognize that as being a shift in form, but I just want to say I see it as consistent with a long-standing practice of locking up Black bodies. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So there's a connection between spirituality and revolution. If that makes no sense to you, then what you can do is sit still a while. John Huggins was killed when he was 23 years old. And I guess I was 20. And one day here in Los Angeles, where we lived in Compton, I was feeling very despairing about that revolution we all think should happen yesterday. And I said to him, John, I feel like I have this tiny bucket of water to put out a gigantic fire. And there's not enough water. What do I do? And he looked at me, and you'll see part of this quote in Campbell Hall. He looked at me and he said, you know, Ericka, a person can't make revolution in society without first making it in himself, in herself. I've never forgotten it. That's why, to answer one of the other questions, it's so important that we practice self-care. We have to know who we are, who's in this body, who's controlling our mind or what. It makes for independence. It makes for inner freedom. And, oh, by the way, my book is called Freedom is an Inside Job. So this idea that there's a revolution that is going to be, and that one group of people will make it happen, I, in my humble experience and understanding, is fallacious, because the revolution is already happening. It's always happening. It's a natural phenomenon, and we need to hook up to it and recognize it. How many of us can say that in every interaction and relationship in our lives, we act independent of societal constructs and concepts? How many of us can truly love the human beings we say we want to serve? So if we don't have a way to take care of here, then we can't really bring about revolution of any kind. It will take all of us, and it is already happening. And it is imperative that we think about the way in which freedom expresses itself in truth. Having been incarcerated only for 2 years, I will tell you that when I saw Eddie Conway, after 37 years, most of which was spent in solitary confinement, when I walked up to him to hug him, there were no words. I couldn't even cry, because revolution was emanating from him. And that night where I saw him, we were in a crowd of people. Everyone who stood near him experienced what happens when you allow yourself to be cleaned of societal bullshit. That is revolution. And it starts, it's not like it's either or. You do it here and you don't do it there, you do it there and you don't do it. We think in squares, and it's all very circular. So I hope that something that I'm saying is landing, because it's so important. And to those of you who want the real revolution, I want to say to you that I want you alive. I need to know, when I close my eyes on this life, that there are young people alive, that they didn't do something premature to leave the planet. We need all of the good minds here. I'm talking kind of in riddles, but that's because when we talk about revolution, I'm not sure we understand what it is, having lived through nearly dying so many times. It's probably not what you think. So, my friend from the American Indian movement, the way to, and all of the other people who talked about the divisions and the gaps and the ways in which we do not respect one another, then we should respect one another. Then we should figure out a way to sit down together. I love that you are a man who is an ally of women. I'm assuming that's who you are, right? Okay. Well, bring together a group of men who are allies of women, or any other subset that we don't talk about enough. We tend to think, even though we say we don't, in dominant culture terms. And then we wonder what happened. So the Black Panther Party, the women of the Black Panther Party have a lot of healing to do. And I set upon my own. And every day I work with it. So I would love to talk to a man about what I experienced, but I know so very few of them who would understand. So having allies is really important. If you're looking for a place on campus, form a mastermind alliance around you. Find your allies if you don't already have them. If you have them, don't forget them. When you are plagued by racism or homophobia or whatever, this misogyny, sexism, whatever the things are, become allies for one another. You heard Fred say, white people don't like black people don't like white people, the hillbillies don't like Indians, the Indians. We're still doing that 50 years later, aren't we? Mm-hmm. So I tried to answer a whole bunch of questions from the inside out. And thank you for being patient with me trying to do that. And thank you very much for spending half the night here with us.